This is With Interest, a business, finance and accounting news podcast brought to you by CPA Australia.
Hello and welcome to With Interest. I'm Dr. Jane Rennie, General Manager, Media and Content at CPA Australia. The federal government has announced plans to legislate an objective for Australia's superannuation system. The government is consulting on precisely what that objective should be, and CPA Australia has made a submission setting out our views. Why we need an objective for superannuation and what it should be is the subject of today's episode. And joining me to discuss this topic is one of the people who wrote CPA Australia's submission, Senior Manager, Advocacy and Retirement Policy, Michael Davison. Welcome to With Interest, Michael.
Thanks, Jane. Great to be here.
Michael, Australia's superannuation system is regularly referred to as world-leading, and not just by Australians, I might add. Do you think this reputation is warranted?
Look, it is. We're rated in the top 5 retirement saving systems in the world. It could be better. We could do some tweaks, but we're certainly up there, and we're looked at from other countries as world-leading.
And one of those tweaks is an objective for super, which the CPA Australia has been asking the government to legislate this for years. And I understand that you feel this lack of sort of a rudder, a definitional rudder, so to speak, has been holding our system back. But why exactly is that?
Yeah, look, I mean, the superannuation legislation has a purpose for superannuation, but it's quite limited. And really what we've seen in the last few years, the super system has $3.4 trillion in it. Held a lot of money. It's our savings for our future. But we seem to have lots of calls on how do we use that money. Governments want to dip into it to fill their budgetary black holes. People want to get into it to fund infrastructure. One of the big ones is people want to access it early for other uses apart from their retirement. So housing, medical procedures, things like that. So having an objective really starts focusing what that purpose is and sort of in some ways protecting our superannuation.
And yet I happen to know that even though the government is consulting on an objective for superannuation, that you're not entirely happy that they're not consulting on the retirement savings system more broadly. But isn't something better than nothing?
Oh, look, I can't argue with that. I mean, the super objective they're putting up is reasonable. It's about what your superannuation is for. We're forced to contribute to our super, and our employers contribute to our super with the aim to encourage us to save our money. But it's really, super's just part of how we fund our retirement. We all have, or a lot of us have, non-super savings or assets, investment properties, shares, etc. The biggest part of your retirement savings is your family home, and yet an objective doesn't look at that, and also how it interacts with the age pension. So really what we need is, super is important, but look at how it interacts with all those other things. And when we retire, it's like we dip into all that. So how does that all come together?
It is a really interesting point, actually, because when I hear the phrase retirement savings, my mind immediately goes to superannuation. But you've mentioned a few things that make up the bigger retirement savings pie. So you mentioned housing. What are some of the others?
Yeah, look, the age pension. We have large holdings in shares in Australia in the share market. It's the old adage of not putting all your eggs in one basket. We do have it spread around. And so when you retire, yes, super's a large mainstay, but the family home is our biggest asset. And it's like, well, how do you tap into that? Can we release some of the equity in it? Do you sell it and downsize? What do you do? So it's like, how does that interact? And for those of us who haven't saved sufficiently, there's the age pension.
Now, in Australia, when the issue of retirement policy does hit the newspapers, usually political parties of all persuasions just start snapping at each other. So it is an incredibly political topic. So what I'm wondering is, realistically, can this activity, that being nailing down an objective for super, be decoupled from the political cycle, or is this just going to be another super bun fight?
Oh, look, I think it's going to be another super bun fight. I mean, it's a nice aspiration that it gets depoliticised, and it's something we've always argued for. But the reality is, as I said, there's $3.4 trillion in the super system. It's a lot of money. There's a lot of people, a lot of interested parties who want to tap into that. So, and each government has their own views. The Labor Party essentially started the super system in Australia. The Liberals criticise it. Some governments lean towards one type of fund, one lean to the other. So it's like, well, how do you pull that together? When you think about the common interest is how do we support Australians to save their retirement so it reduces the pressure on governments to fund retirement, to fund the age pension.
So, Michael, in the consultation paper, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this, because I know the government has provided a main objective or suggested a main objective and then two alternate wordings on this. What are they? Can you walk us through the key elements of those three options?
Look, the government has said the objective of super is to preserve savings to deliver income for a dignified retirement alongside government support in an equitable and sustainable way. Look, and we agree with the spirit of that. However, we feel it's coming a bit short because it talks about preserving savings. It doesn't talk about how do we encourage people to save, what incentives do we provide, and how do we compensate them for the fact it's being preserved? We're locking our money away for 30, 40 years. Should we be compensated for that? It talks about delivering income. Retirement is about having that income in retirement, having a steady stream, whilst having some scope for those one-off lump sum payments and paying for aged care, etc. So that's reasonable, equitable and sustainable. You cannot argue about that. It needs to be equitable, and the government has to be able to pay for it. One of the big issues it talks about alongside government support. So it's sort of saying, is it super? Is it the age pension? Whereas back to our earlier point, it's about both of those, but it's alongside your non-super savings, the family home, etc. They've had some alternative wording which sort of tweaks that a bit. It's around delivering income for a dignified retirement, so removes that preservation bit. And the one we've said we'd support is the objective of super is to support savings to deliver income for a dignified retirement. So it's supporting that broader savings model as opposed to just focusing on protecting your superannuation.
And what would CPA Australia propose doing to make that definition better?
Oh, look, it comes back to before we can define the purpose of super, we need to define how the retirement savings system works and agree where the super system fits into that. Only then can we really define the objective or the purpose of superannuation itself.
You mentioned that the proposed definition talks about savings to deliver income for a dignified retirement. That seems to go to the question of adequacy, whether people have enough. But I wanted to ask you about that, because what is that concept of dignified retirement? How much is that? And doesn't it depend a lot on where you're standing? I mean, if you are someone who owns their house, and you mentioned that before as a critical factor to security in retirement, you're in a very different position financially to someone who doesn't. So what's your take on the factors that influence how much is enough and whether the government should weigh in on that question of adequacy?
Yeah, Jane, the question of adequacy is really like how long is that piece of string? Adequacy is about, the expectation you maintain your standard of living or reasonable standard of living in retirement. So the standard of living we're used to now, we forego some of our income knowing that if we're saving it, we can sort of maintain that standard of living when we retire. That's the main thing. The system's there. Look, the age pension will support those who don't have the ability to save. The super system is really directed at the middle group of Australians, so to support them to save and have a little bit more. Those who are high income earners have other means to save. They don't need the incentives as much as middle Australia. The family home is really important. The system is predicated on owning your own home, and the fact that your housing costs disappear in retirement, so you don't need as much to live on as you do while you're working. For that, and we're seeing home ownership drop in Australia, so it's going to be much harder for people to retire with their own home, and then you're going to have sufficient retirement savings to be able to continue paying rent. And that's one of the biggies, is that the system has to be able to support those people.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you should check out our in-depth business and finance show, In the Black. Search for In the Black on your favourite podcast app today. And now, back to With Interest.
You mentioned that in Australia, it is a system that does force people to put aside that money into superannuation for, say, 40 or more years, depending on how young you are when you start working. And I'm just curious, in order to achieve a sufficient level of retirement savings, does a superannuation system need to be mandatory? Could you ever get there to adequacy if it wasn't mandatory?
Look, I think there's been various systems around the world that demonstrate, and even our pre-mandatory system demonstrate that we're not that good at saving. We'll save some money, we save for a house deposit, but we have numerous other expenses. We get distracted. The reality is we're not good at saving. So there needs to be a bit of a push that we can save. It's not everything, but it has to be something. And most people accept it and are comfortable with it as long as it's set at the right level and it's not onerous.
There's another element I wanted to ask you about, and that was that concept of sustainability, which I guess in a nutshell is making sure the government, the economy, and future generations can afford to support the superannuation system. Super does have a lot of concessions built in and special tax treatment, and those concessions are very costly for governments. Why do we build them in, and is it necessary to do that?
It's interesting, the government's measure of the concessions is probably not particularly accurate because they compare it to you pay less tax in superannuation, and they compare that to the tax you'd pay on other savings or investments at your top marginal rate. The reality is other investments have concessional tax treatment as well. The main reason we have tax concessions is, one, to encourage you and reward you for saving, but also it's also compensating for the fact that it is locked away. So if we didn't have those incentives, those rewards, um, we're not very good savers. Why would we do it?
Presumably, though, there needs to be a cap on that level of government support, otherwise the system won't be sustainable. What and how do we determine what the right level is?
Look, that comes back to my earlier point that the high income earners will find other ways to save. They have the means to save. So we totally support there should be a limit on the tax concessions aimed at superannuation and savings. I don't know what the right limit is. The government has been proposing an extra tax on earnings for if you have more than $3 million in your super. To us, that seems a bit low, but it's like, how do you determine that when you compare it to housing prices now? When you look at the average house in Sydney and Melbourne, or the median price is close to $1.5 million. So how do you set it? It's right. If you've got a couple living off one person's super, how do you determine what's right? If, like I said, you're not owning your own home and you'll go pay rent, additional housing costs, continuing housing costs in retirement, what's the right number? It's different for everyone.
Michael, when does this consultation actually close, and what will happen next in terms of government action?
The consultation closed last Friday, the 31st of March. What happens next? There is no firm timetable from the government. They have proposed some other super changes which we expect to see in the budget and come into effect in July 2025. So I think there's a political imperative to get this sorted pretty quickly, but they haven't actually set a timetable for when the legislation may be introduced into Parliament and passed.
Okay, so it might actually be a year or two away.
Absolutely. The fact it's on their agenda at the moment, it's probably not that long away, but it's certainly not going to be the next month.
What would it mean once this objective actually comes in, is legislated? What does that mean for current and future super fund members in a practical sense? Will it actually change anything for them, or might it limit any other attempts at introducing new ways for people to access their super early?
I think for the average super member, I don't think it's going to change much. It provides a guiding light or some guardrails as to how the system works. And I think what it will do will sort of refocus that it is about retirement, saving for your retirement, and just clearly articulate that super's retirement is not for that early release around housing or COVID payments or medical procedures, etc. So it's just that refocusing to guide super funds, super fund advisors, and this government and future governments.
Well, just to that point, this government and future governments, how would a future government be held accountable to it? I mean, couldn't they just change it if they didn't like the objective as legislated?
Jane, that's the big risk. There is nothing stopping this government or future governments from changing the objective or not complying with it. So in our submission, we've suggested this needs to be reviewed regularly as part of the intergenerational report, which is done every 5 years and projects forward 40 years as to what the system's going to look like. And possibly the government needs to be held to account from, say, the Productivity Commission or the Australian National Audit Office to look at how they are complying to it and complying with the spirit of the legislation.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I suspect we're going to hear a great deal more about it in the public domain, but that is all that we've got time for today. Thanks very much to our guest expert, Michael Davison. If you'd like to know more about today's topic, a link to CPA Australia's submission on legislating an objective for the superannuation system is included in the show notes. With Interest is a weekly podcast. If you like what you've heard today, why not subscribe on your favourite podcast app? From all of us here at CPA Australia, thanks for listening.
You've been listening to With Interest, a CPA Australia podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, help others discover With Interest by leaving us a review and sharing this episode with colleagues, clients, or anyone else interested in the latest finance, business, and accounting news. To find out more about our other podcasts and CPA Australia, check the show notes for this episode. We hope you can join us again for another episode of With Interest.